Good afternoon. Welcome to Firat Education's webinar series on college admissions in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. My name is Ibrahim Firat, and I'm the Chief Educational Consultant for Firat Education. Today's topic is when the Ivy League institutions opt for test optional, what to do now. So obviously we're going to cover not just the Ivy League institutions, which are 8 of them, but also I'll talk a little bit about the highly competitive colleges that are not Ivy League that have gone test optional. A little bit about myself. I have been educational consulting for 15 years, 12 years of which is under Firat Education. I've started off as an SAT and ACT tutor before this profession, and then quickly switched over to college admissions consulting and finding the best fit colleges for our students and families. I've published 9 books. Our students have gotten over 1,000 college acceptances, 38 of which were Ivy schools. 14 of which were international, and I personally almost visited 300 colleges around the country, and my students have earned over $88 million in total merit-based scholarships. I'm a professional member of the Independent Educational Consultants Association, IECA, and also NACAC and TACAC, the gold standards in college admissions counseling. Today's webinar is going to talk a little bit about what is test optional, a brief history of test optional, the data that's collected, and then Ivies actually going test optional, and what does that mean? What will it mean moving forward? Application factors, what do colleges normally look at, and what will they look at after choosing test optional? And to submit scores or not to submit scores, followed by Q&A. So on the Zoom feature, if you've joined me on Zoom today, you will notice a Q&A feature. So please post your questions as I'm going through this presentation. I will have approximately 45 minutes to talk with you about this. And this presentation is going to be followed by our regional consultants breakout sessions, depending on where you live. That information will be posted later on through the end of the presentation on the chat box with specific links to specific regions. So let's start with what exactly is test optional and how does it differ from the other terms. First of all, test optional pretty much means applicants are not required to submit SAT, ACT scores as part of their college admissions application, which means that some students still do submit the SAT, ACT scores to these colleges. Test flexible term is similar and has been around for a while. Applicants can pretty much submit any test score, SAT, ACT, AP, etc., depending on the institution as part of their application. Typically, many colleges have been test flexible. SAT and ACT are either way, they're accepted. Some colleges, very few colleges have opted for AP or IB scores in lieu of SAT and ACT, but very few colleges. And then there's the test blind term. In this case, the applicant's SAT, ACT scores, even if they were mistakenly submitted to the college, are not reviewed as part of their admissions application. This is huge, very different than the test optional, because even if you submit the scores, colleges are not going to look at your scores. One prominent college that has gone test blind for the upcoming cycle for fall 2021 is California Institute of Technology, otherwise known as Caltech. It's huge for this #2 college across the nation when it comes to STEM programs to choose test blind for their fall 2021 admissions. It's a huge step forward towards test optional and test blind admissions being the new normal for college admissions. And in this case, obviously, the factors that determine the fit for admissions into Caltech for a test blind school is a little bit similar to the factors that are required for applying to a test optional school without the test scores. And I'll talk to you a little bit about that a little bit soon. But I want you to know that test optional is not a new trend. In fact, back in 1969, Bowdoin College was the first college ever to have opted for test optional. And 300 plus colleges in 2005 came together as a consortium and pretty much decided test scores do not equal to merit. And notable names followed after that: WPI 2007, Wake Forest 2008, and very recently, University of California, largest public school system in the country, UPenn, and Columbia, which are the Ivy institutions. So back in 2007, there were about 800 plus colleges that were test optional. Now, as of today, that number is 1,200 plus. That's a huge growth, and we expect this number to grow even more rapidly moving forward. Why test optional? Colleges opt for test optional for 4 of these reasons. Diversity, to increase diversity in their population. So dropping these tests as part of a requirement actually leads to greater diversity on campus for qualified minority, low-income, first-generation female and other students for applying. And test optional also allows academically capable students that otherwise are not good at testing, but they're really successful, for them to apply and have a chance. High school performance is prioritized as the #1 factor when schools go test optional. And extracurricular activities and the personality fit of the student are more closely followed and looked at as part of their admissions application as well. Test optional during COVID-19 is the hottest trend in college admissions. In fact, it's the most popular college admissions trend. And that's exacerbated by the fact that SAT, ACT cancellations have happened spring and summer 2020. And SAT and ACT are both announcing plans to do an online at-home testing that creates not just a bunch of, uncertainties, but also inequity and in access, as seen by the AP test scandal back in May with the College Board. Class of 2021, who are rising seniors now, are the most impacted group of this test optional trend. Some of them have taken maybe 1 official test, maybe none. And in this case, the colleges are responding by going test optional and providing option for these rising seniors to apply with or without. Class of 2022, class of 2023, or even later classes might be impacted as well. But for now, we're expecting that class of 2021 be the most impacted group. FairTestorg, which is a National Center for Fair and Open Testing, has compiled a list of colleges that have gone test optional since 2005. So in fact, 1969, if you look further down. So this screenshot shows that. So I highly recommend you guys to go and visit this website and see if your college that you're considering has gone test optional. But I always hear this: when I hear the term optional on anything, especially on job applications, college application, etc., I read them between the lines. You don't have to, but you better do it. So your gut feeling may say this. The question is this true for test optional? And I know you're going to hate this answer, but it depends. It depends because every college does things differently. Every university evaluates students in ways only it itself understands. And test optional, unfortunately, makes it that much more complicated. But I'm here to break it down for you. And in fact, I have looked into data for test optional for colleges like Bowdoin, which has been the first college to go test optional in 1969, Chicago, which has gone test optional last year in 2019, and also University of Delaware, which has gone test optional in 2017. I have done a presentation on this back in April where I broke down 3 of these case studies down to the nearest data points. So please go back and watch that test optional video from April. In fact, my colleague is going to put a link to the YouTube video for that test optional presentation so that you can see that. But I will summarize the data interpretation for you before I move on to the IVs. So the data pretty much showed us that test optional trend has caused more than 70% of applicants on average still submit the SAT and ACT scores to those colleges. And not surprisingly, but for some it is, test optional colleges are just as selective, if not more so, as they were pre-test optional times. They just look at other factors not just SAT, ACT scores, or if you don't submit them, obviously you don't have those scores to be considered. The other interpretation shows more students apply to test optional colleges as applicants believe they have a better shot at getting admitted with the absence of SAT and ACT scores. Remember, test optional colleges, and some of them are very strict about this, they say they still require SAT, ACT if applicants would like to be considered for merit-based aid. I'd like to open a certain asterisk here with that, because some colleges for this particular year, because of all the COVID conversations and cancellations, some colleges that normally would look at the SAT and ACT scores as part of their merit aid review have actually gone on to say, you know what, we're just going to look at the GPA and or the rank, not the SAT, ACT scores. So in order to find out if your institution that has gone test optional is still requiring SAT, ACT for merit aid, I suggest you reach out to that institution's admissions office and find out. Test optional colleges are reporting higher average SAT, ACT scores than scores from pre-test optional times. And you can only guess why, because if you have the scores and if they're higher than the normal admitted average of the admissions data for the college from previous years, why not submit, especially if you're going to be considered for merit-based aid? That's why test option colleges are reporting higher scores, and then it gets considered. And we also found out that the more experienced the college is with test optional, the better it knows how to equitably weigh other factors in admissions. What that essentially means is, if a college has been test optional for, say, more than 5 years, they've gone through 5 cycles of admissions to really know where to look at to decide whether a student is a good fit for their institution or not. So if a school has just recently announced test optional or just have been piloting it because of what's going on with COVID, chances are that that admissions office is going to be scrambling to kind of find out how to reasonably and equitably, admit a student based on the data that's presented besides the SAT, ACT scores. So it's a little bit of a risky choice, but it still could be helpful for some students. Now, topic of the hour. In fact, when the Ivies crash the party, and I call it crashing the party because it literally is what it is. Nobody have thought that the Ivies would join this movement, but because of what's happening, some Ivies, not all, have gone to test optional. So I have some data that shows how Ivies have, I guess, performed their admissions process before, and then how we predict they'll perform it after they've gone test optional. First of all, let me first break the, I guess, the question about which schools are Ivy League. There's so much misinformation about Stanford being an Ivy League school or Duke being an Ivy League school. No, Ivy League schools, there are only 8 of them, and they are part of a NCAA pretty much conference. So that's why they're called Ivy League. And there's 8 of them. These are the 8. These are in the order of the rank as you see national ranking. And I pointed out the ones that have gone test optional as of today. So those are Columbia, UPenn, Dartmouth, and Cornell. And Princeton, Harvard, Yale, and Brown have not yet made an announcement. Again, the keyword is yet. We might see some movement, maybe not today, maybe later this evening, maybe next week, we'll see. But this is really promising because 50% of the Ivies are now test optional. And here's the data. So this data is from the common data set, which pretty much every college in the country has to put out every admission cycle. This data is from 2019 for Princeton, who has not announced test optional yet. So a couple of, I guess, data points to point out. Notice C1 line right here. You'll notice that total applicants are approximately 35,300 students. And total admitted, you're looking at 1,800, 1,900 students. That, if you do the math, selectivity is 5.5%. And the data of the students who are enrolled, you can see in C11 here, 87.7% have a GPA of 3.75 or higher, and average high school GPA is 3.9. And then you will notice the ACT and SAT scores, 25th percentile to 75th percentile, which is essentially the middle range. For SAT, we're looking at 1440 to 1570. And for the ACT, we're looking at 32 to 35. But now that data is broken down further to the right. You'll see about 80 to 86, well, more than 85% on average have scored at 700 to 800 on the SAT in each section. And on the ACT, more than 90% have scored 30 to 36. So you can only see the most selective institution in the country right now with 5.5% admissions rate, Princeton, is reporting these numbers, and they have not gone test optional yet. So if they remain not test optional, obviously these numbers are going to be disrupted. So think about it from a college's perspective, from Princeton's perspective. Would you take more of a 24 to 29 applicant, because that number is probably going to increase if they don't opt for test optional moving forward? They're going to see a rise there. Or would they rather go test optional and then hopefully increase the 30 to 36 range? So the answer is simple, and that's why these colleges are opting for test optional. Of course, in addition to it, they want to give you the chance to be reviewed and to increase diversity and so on. But their data, colleges' data, highly selective colleges like these, their data is their everything. So because of that, we're seeing that, we're predicting that, and that's why I said not announced test optional yet. Here is the other Ivy League school that has announced test optional. That's UPenn, and this is their data from last year. So you'll notice that they have over 44,000 applicants last year, and they admitted about 3,700. So that's 8.3% admissions selectivity percentage. You'll notice 85% of them have 3.75 or higher GPA, very similar to Princeton's, and 3.9 average GPA. And you look at SAT, ACT scores, you'll notice that 1440 to 1560 number, very, very close to the Princeton's numbers, and also 32 to 35 composite on the ACT. And then to the right, when you break it down further, you will notice that 700 to 800 range, or per section, or approximately 1400 to 1600, that's about 85% of the applicants. And then you look at the ACT breakdown, more than 90% scored at 30 to 36. So I'll tell you what my predictions are with UPenn a little bit after I cover the top factors in college admissions that these guys have been used to looking at and what they're going to have to look at moving forward. So this applies to any and every college in the country, not just the Ivies. Number one factor in admissions for a college is GPA and or class rank. So if your school ranks, then of course they're going to look at it, but if they don't, then they're going to look at the GPA. Number two factor is they're going to look at the curriculum rigor. So a 4.0 is great, but if you've gotten that 4.0 with only regular classes versus somebody who's got a 4.7 with loaded APs and dual credits and honors classes, then college will take that into account. So that's the curriculum rigor piece. Notice the SAT, ACT scores are close number 3. So colleges have been using this as a factor, especially the Ivy League institutions. Relevant activities and leadership, so that's the in and outside of school activities for a student or their resume. College essay, so the main essay, the personal statement, as well as the supplemental essays for the institution. That's also extremely critical for the college to understand who they're about to admit and whether they're a good fit for their institution and their community. Strong recommendation letters, more important than ever now, especially now that schools have gone virtual and pass and fail and AP tests getting online. You know, colleges are going to be relying more and more on strong recommendation letters from teachers and counselors than ever. So that's been a very important factor as well. And number 7, the ability to pay. We've seen this with the class of 2020 that has just graduated from high school and entering in fall of 2020 to colleges. If they have been waitlisted, more and more of them are clearing the waitlist if their application originally did not show a need for financial aid. So we believe that this might be also a trend for fall of 2021, maybe even fall of 2022. So I wanted to put these factors on a graph so you can see how colleges treat these. So you'll notice this is, by the way, not indicative of any particular college, but this is on average, colleges put about 30% weight on GPA and class rank, and about 25% on the curriculum rigor. So that's more than 50%. If you apply with test scores, still 55% of your admissions decision is based on not the SAT, ACT scores. So that's a very important factor to keep in mind. And then the third factor is the SAT and ACT. That's 20%. So 20% of a whole 100 is still not as scary as one might think about how testing culture has really pushed our society to the brink of giving up for college admissions. So really, it's only 20% on average for colleges. There are other factors that they look at. So test optional, while it makes a difference, big difference, it's not huge of a difference given that on average colleges only look at it 20% of the time. And then 10% is about the resume, 5% college essays, 5% rec letters, and 5% ability to pay. Now, if you look at, say an Ivy institution like Columbia might have a very different distribution and not a set formula. Year by year, this may change as well. Then an institution like Duke, which is not Ivy, but just as selective. Or you'll look at an institution like University of Virginia, which is also test optional, just announced test optional. But they're not as selective as, say, a Princeton. So they may have a very different distribution of this graph right here than the other institutions. So every institution has it differently, but this is on average. What happens when you apply without test scores? Obviously, that 20% that you just saw needs to get redistributed to elsewhere to make it a pie of 100%. So the way we have seen these being distributed in the past by looking at the data is that the pie for GPA, class rank, and curriculum rigor has increased from 55% to approximately on average 65%. So the high school performance has become the gold standard for admissions for test optional colleges. And of course, in and outside of school activities, relevant activities and leadership, that's 15% now instead of a 10. College essays, the personality fit became more of a big deal. Strong recommendation letters became more of a big deal. Ability to pay may remain the same, may have increased maybe by a percentage point, but you get the idea. So colleges will redistribute those factors depending on their institutional goals, depending on what they're looking to form in that new class coming in. So here is the predicted data for University of Pennsylvania that has just announced test optional. So the data that you see on the screen is the same data from 2019 that I just showed you. So nothing is new there. But what is new is the circled areas. Because of the test optional trend previously in other institutions, we expect an Ivy League type highly selective institution, not just Penn, but any Ivy League or a highly selective institution, to see a surge of applicants in total. Because more and more students are going to believe that, well, you know what, Penn is test optional, why not? Let's just give it a shot. So that number that was 44,000 last year, we expect that number to go up to about 60,000 for next year. So having said that, you might ask, is it quality or quantity of applicants? That's a great question. It depends. So if the applicants are educated enough about the test optional trend and they have done their work, or they watched this webinar and saw what matters, then you know what? Those are quality applicants. They probably focused on their college essay, their recommendation letters, their resume. They boosted their resume. They really wrote a stellar COVID-19 essay on the additional information section or the news section on the Common App or on the Coalition, in addition to their personal statements and their supplemental essays. Then probably that increase of quality applicants is going to be what Penn will see or similar schools will see. But notice what that does to selectivity. Assuming that their admitted class is going to be ranging from 3,500 to 4,200, their selectivity is going to increase to about like from 8.3% to about 6%, 5-6%. Remember, Princeton, that has not gone test optional just yet, has 5.5. So Penn, just by making that decision to go test optional, might be just as selective as Princeton when it comes to admission selectivity. And then you look at the SAT, ACT scores. So right now, the way it is, obviously, is about 85% for students who have scored 700 to 800 on each section on the SAT. We expect that number to go up to 90% plus, because those who will submit under test optional an SAT score are those who have done well. And then same thing with the composite on the ACT. 30 to 36 was about 91% before. And after test optional, we expect that percentage to go up to about 95%. So you can see on FairTest website that there's a nice PDF that gets updated on a regular basis. Last update here is June 4th. You can see the ranking of institutions that are test optional currently. So that's why you see 520 plus top tier is the key in terms of colleges that their admissions are test optional for fall 2021. So I point this out simply because many people think that if a college is test optional, they're not good enough. Absolutely false. And you can only see that with the Ivies going test optional, even if it's pilot. You can see National Liberal Arts Colleges here. The top 3 institutions, the top National Liberal Arts Colleges in the country, Williams, Amherst, and Swarthmore, are test optional. 5 is Pomona, test optional. Top 10, in fact, there's only 2 or 3 schools that are not test optional in the National Liberal Arts rankings. So you can only see it's not about selectivity. It's not about viability, credibility of the institution. It's about who to admit and how to admit. National universities, number 3 ranking. Columbia is right there as a national university. Chicago and test optional in 2019. UPenn, Dartmouth, Cornell, those are the Ivies. So you can see that those institutions that are nationally recognized are also test optional. So the full list on FairTest.org. Now, the question of the day, to submit or not to submit. So it's tricky. And when I did this webinar back in April, it was a little bit more clearer because not as many highly selective institutions have yet to go test optional. But now that they have, and we need to look at a few factors to make sure you get the sound advice. So my advice is submit SAT, ACT scores if, 1, college has just recently announced test optional. I know it sounds like, well, you just broke my heart because, you know, all these highly selective institutions just announced it. Yes, but notice the and or part. College is only piloting test optional. So on FairTest list, you will notice in an asterisk or in parentheses, you will see temporary or piloting for a class of 2021 or 2022. So if you see that asterisk, they're really only doing this for a year or 2, and then they're going to review it for later. So keep those in mind and really be careful if you want to not submit to an institution that is piloting test optional. 3, college is highly selective, which are the colleges we're talking about right now, but and your scores. Maybe you took it once, the SAT and ACT, and your scores are at or above the middle 50% of submitted scores. Guess what? I just showed you that data from last year for 2 institutions. You can see the data of each institution by going to their website, admissions pages, and type common data set on their search box. And towards the middle of that about 20, 30-page document, you will see the data that I have shown you on the screen today. So you can see for yourself whether your numbers are good enough to submit so you don't leave them with any questions. Number 4, your SAT, ACT scores offset some gaps in other factors of admissions. So say you scored a 34 on ACT, you know, it's good, but not excellent. I mean, for some of the Ivies, but you know what? Your GPA is at 3.7. So maybe at that point, then you can think about adding that 34 ACT to your admissions profile. And lastly, you're absolutely in need of merit-based aid. So that's a given. Like if the college says you still need it, and then if you need the money, then you need to submit the SAT, ACT scores. And here's another reason. This is a screenshot from a student of mine when Cornell announced test optional. Look at this red circle area. In Cornell's review during the 2020-2021 application cycle, results from the ACT or SAT might still be a meaningful differentiator, in particular for students who live near or attend a school that will be open or have not experienced lost income for one or more of the household providers. Cornell has announced test optional with these 2 bullet points as reference. And my student who is considering Cornell as an institution said, wait, what do I do now? So you can only imagine and see why my advice has been the way it has been. When do you not submit the SAT, ACT scores? So 1, your SAT, ACT scores are not representative of your overall admissions profile. Obviously, if you are a 4.7 student, but you're not a good test taker and your highest ACT is at 31 and you're considering U Chicago or Dartmouth as a college, well, the 31 may not make the cut, but guess what? U Chicago and Dartmouth are both test optional. Now is your chance to apply to Dartmouth without the ACT scores. So that's a good example. Test optional is in the DNA of the college you're applying to. In other words, experienced in test optional trend. So if we're dealing with an NYU or Wake Forest, which have gone test optional like about 10 years ago, I mean, those colleges know when they receive an applicant with no test scores, they know what to look for, and they don't make assumptions either. Having said that, I hear this from families all the time, and they ask me, the students ask me this too. What if I apply to an institution with no test scores? Will they assume that I did bad? The answer is no. All of these institutions that have gone test optional make institutional promise. I mean, that goes a long way. They do believe truly if you don't submit, then they believe you couldn't submit because of circumstances. So don't assume that they're going to hold that against you because you're not submitting scores, but make sure everything else is shining. And number 3, if you can differentiate yourself in other factors of admissions, which I did cover earlier, and if you can go above and beyond, great, then you don't really have to submit the SAT and ACT scores. So again, you have to do your homework. You have to look at what these colleges' average accepted numbers have been. And if your numbers, if you have any, are meeting those standards, great, maybe it's a good idea to submit. And if you don't, for any reason, then do I have any other factors that I can make outshine and I will still be competitive? And even if the answer is, well, I don't know, you still have a better chance now than you did last year when these schools were not test optional. So it's worth a shot. And I always close it out with this: submit test scores if you can, and don't submit if you must. That would be my best advice in terms of the test optional trend nowadays. It's even for Ivy League institutions that are just trying this out. So a couple of contact points for us: our website, our phone numbers, and social media pages. And I've been on the media, national, local, and state media, to talk about these trends since COVID hit pretty much back in March. So if you'd like to follow me on Twitter, I'm pretty active there, as well as on LinkedIn. So please keep keep your communication close with me. If you have any specific questions, you can reach out to our company or myself. What's going to happen next on our webinar series is there's regional breakout sessions that are hosted by my colleagues at Firat Education. So we're covering the entire United States. So Northeast is going to be covered by my consultant in New York, Dana Marvin, and Massachusetts, Kevin March. So if you're interested in the Ivy League institutions, you know, and you have specific questions about those guys, then you should attend the Northeast session. Southeast session, Cheryl Jensen from Tennessee and Hiba Aga from Georgia. They are covering the Southeast region of the United States, including Florida. And Texas, both public and private institutions in Texas are covered by my colleagues, Dr. Nishan Jones in Dallas-Fort Worth area and Chris Stafford in Plano, Texas area. And the entire West Coast, including the Midwest, is covered by my colleague, Courtney Green, based in Arizona. So in your chat boxes right now, my colleague is putting the links for each of these regional breakouts. So you've just gotten the big picture test optional trend and what to do, what to think about, and what not to do. But these specific regional breakouts are going to help you answer your questions specific to that region, maybe even down to the specific college that you're interested in. So I highly suggest you attend these as well. And I will now look at the Q&A to answer your questions before I wrap it up for regional breakouts to start. So here we go, Q&A. Let's see here, let me share my screen. Okay, so question number 1. Would test optional be something you believe University of Texas would consider? I've actually, if you go into my Twitter, you will notice how many times I've tagged UT Austin and Be a Longhorn admissions page to say, hey, look, UC went test optional, it's your turn. UVA went test optional, it's your turn. Dartmouth went test optional, it's your turn. No response from UT. Look, it might happen because UVA and UC, the two very competitive, very big public institutions, have gone test optional. UT might. We just don't know when, but we need to know soon because, you know, soon enough, these students are going to decide whether they have to take the SAT or ACT, especially if they're fall of 2021 admissions. The second question, what do you suggest as for upcoming juniors for tutoring, etc., for preparing for SAT, ACT, as it kills me to put the time and expense if this trend continues? Extremely great question. So what I would do first is I would look at I would start with your college list, if you have a college list. If you have even a large list of like 30 plus colleges, and go to FairTestorg and see what percentage of those colleges are test optional, either temporarily or permanently. If they're temporarily test optional and do not cover your year of admissions, I would say you have to make some adjustments and, you know, some preparation starting this summer. If majority of your list is test optional for indefinitely, then you know what? If you can outshine in other factors of admissions as I covered it right now, maybe you don't have to worry about tutoring for the SAT and ACT. But keep that in mind, test optional, you've seen the data. If you need the merit-based aid, you know, for some of these institutions, and SAT, ACT is still tied to it, you might still need it. So maybe you should also look into test blind colleges who absolutely don't care about admissions with SAT, ACT scores. The third question, let's see here. If you have a good ACT score, but you honestly believe you could do better if you had a chance to take the test again, should you still submit the only score you have? Great question. So if you have only one really solid test score, but you can do better, I would start with the college list again. So look at the data from last year and see where you fall with your score. Say that, you know, the average admitted class had a 30 to 33 ACT and your score is a 34. Well, guess what? You probably are good with the 34. Don't sweat it too much. But if the average is 33 to 36 and you have a 34 and you think you can do better, I suggest you might want to at least take it once if you can. But if you cannot, then ask yourself whether you can outshine your application profile in other factors, whether this is GPA, test, or essays, resume, or others. Any advice for students who already have a top score? Like I said, again, it goes back to the college list in the admitted class. If your numbers are matching the middle 50% or higher of the admitted class from last year, if you have like 36, submit it to the test optional college. Test blind, don't submit it. It's not going to do any good. Okay. Let's see. I want to make sure that I answered all the questions. So if you look at the chat box, you will also notice that additional test optional information where I broke down the data that I interpreted for you for this session. You can watch the whole thing and see how the data interpretation has come out to be. But also, then you can come back and watch this, and really it's a continuation of series. And then my colleague Parker has also listed the web links for the regional breakouts that are going to start in a few minutes here. So if you click that link and join, you will be able to join that meeting with my fellow consultants. So you can ask specific regional questions as well as college-specific questions regarding test optional, including some public and private institutions. So I don't think there's any other questions for me. So I really appreciate your time today. I hope this was helpful. If you have any questions at all, please find us on social media. Firat Education, anywhere that social media is, pretty much Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, Firat Education, or you can follow me, IC Firat, on Twitter, and you can ask us any questions you may have. Thanks so much for joining us today, and hope to see you next at one of our regional breakouts. Take care.